Good evening, and welcome back. And I want you to know, before I say anything that matters, before we go anywhere tonight, that I almost didn't start this one. I sat here for longer than I should admit, looking at the blank thing in front of me. Not because I didn't know where to begin, but because I knew too well. Because this particular city has a way of making you feel that whatever you say about it is going to fall short. In some way, you can't quite name some dimension of it that slips through the words you choose. And I've been sitting with that feeling, and I've decided to begin anyway, the same way you settle in right now, the same way the weight of the day releases you, whether you invite it to or not. The blanket finding its shape, the room going softer at the edges, is a particular quality of night silence that is different from every other silence. And tonight, we are going somewhere that should not exist. A city, stone, gold, quiet, rising out of salt water and mud and the particular stubbornness that only comes to people who have genuinely run out of other places to go. Hold one thing in your mind before we move further. Just one. You can set it down later if it doesn't serve you. But for now, the most powerful thing this city ever built was not a ship, not a palace, not a wall, not a war fleet wide enough to eat the whole horizon. The most powerful thing this city ever built was a system, a mechanism, a design for making sure that no single person could ever accumulate too much power inside it. And if you sit with that long enough, if you let it actually land somewhere in you, it starts to reveal something true and a little uncomfortable, not just about Venice, but about every arrangement of power that any group of human beings has ever tried to hold together, which is that the only kind of power that survives is the kind that distrusts itself, that builds its own constraints in, that is afraid of what it might become. We are going tonight into the 1,000-year republic, La Serenissima, the most serene, the impossible city of merchants and water and ceremony, gilded and secretive and improbable, which climbed out of a desperate retreat into a desolate lagoon and became, against everything that reason would have predicted, one of the most consequential experiments in governance that human beings have ever conducted. And I promise you, I give you this one promise before we go deep, and that by the time this night has done what it does and carried you where it carries you, something of what this city was will have settled into you the way the good things settle, without force, sideways, the way cold light moves over old water. There is a question buried under all of it, not the obvious one. Not how did they build on water, not how did they get so rich, not how did a republic of merchants end up with an empire that ran from the cold Adriatic all the way to the Black Sea coast, the sun-hammered harbors of Cyprus. Those are real questions, but they are surface questions. The one underneath them is simpler, darker. And what happens to people when every ordinary option is gone? When the land they came from is burning and the sea in front of them is cold and the mud underfoot won't hold the weight of a future and they have to build one anyway. What quality is that? What comes out of that particular degree of desperation, that corner? Venice answered that question across 1,000 years, and the answer is not comfortable. What came out was pragmatism. Ferocious, almost, I want to say inhuman, but that's not right. It was entirely human, the most human possible response to an inhuman situation. Strip away sentiment, strip away gesture, strip away every beautiful impulse that doesn't solve the immediate problem, and do what the problem requires. And if you are stubborn enough and clever enough and lucky in exactly the right places, what you sometimes build out of that stripping away is something that lasts. Here's the thing nobody mentions when they talk about Venetian beauty, Venetian genius, the amber glow of the piazza in the evening, the same quality that made Venice great, made Venice capable of its worst acts. These are not separable. The same calculating intelligence that designed the most sophisticated constitutional checks in the medieval world, the overlapping councils, the electoral lotteries, the term limits that were almost comic in their obsessive specificity, also designed with equal precision a machinery of state surveillance that most modern states would find embarrassing to admit they admired. The same pragmatism that gave ordinary people opera and gambling and the masked freedom of Carnival also gave a committee called the Council of Ten the authority to arrest, to try, to execute in total and documented secrecy. The same commercial intelligence that built the most efficient shipyard in human history. And we will get to the arsenal, because I cannot help myself. The arsenal is the thing I've been most excited to talk about since I started writing this. Also steered an army of crusaders away from Jerusalem and toward the sack of a Christian city for profit, because the profit was available and the opportunity was clear. I need to pause here, not because the material is overwhelming, though it is, but because I think there's a risk of losing the thread in the darkness of it, the machinery of evil part. And I want to be precise about what I'm saying. I am not saying Venice was uniquely monstrous. I'm not saying the Venetians were more ruthless than their contemporaries. What I'm saying is that they were more honest about what they were. Honest in the most operational sense, in the sense that their institutions reflected their actual values rather than their stated ones. And their actual value was this: the world is not interested in your feelings, but it will respect your ability to read it clearly. That's Venice, a city that learned to read clearly, a city built on water that learned to think like water, moving around obstacles, finding the available passage, carrying weight without appearing to. Anyway, what you need to understand before we go further into the streets of this city, before we go inside its chambers and its prisons and its shipyards and its counting houses, is that Venice was a story about a system, not about heroes, a system. And systems don't have consciences. This is the thing that always catches people off guard, I think, because we are trained from early on to understand history as a story of individuals, of good people and bad people making choices. And Venice refuses that framework almost completely. The system had a logic. The logic was the logic of the merchant, the logic of someone who has learned, really learned, in the bone, that sentiment is luxury and clarity is survival. So that's where we begin. In the lagoon, at the edges of everything, where a people with nowhere else to go decided to build something that shouldn't be possible. And what they built, the beauty and the brutality of it, the gold and the mouths carved in stone, where you dropped your denunciations of your neighbors, all of it came from that same root, that same cold, clear way of seeing the world. We will go through it together. I'll be here when you drift. Just let the city rise out of the water in whatever form it takes tonight. Feel that for a moment. The stone beneath you is not earth, it is timber. Thousands of wooden stakes driven down through 100 years of labor, through the soft mud of the lagoon floor, down and down, until they hit the dense clay beneath, and then sealed in cold, anaerobic darkness from the rot that would otherwise consume them across the centuries. An upside-down forest, holding up a civilization, and the trees that could not grow in the lagoon, driven beneath it to become the thing the lagoon stands on. And if you let the full weight of that image settle, the underground forest, the city above it, the water moving around it, the centuries of human life conducted in narrow channels between one marble facade and the next, you feel something, somewhere in the chest. The particular quality of a life lived with the constant low awareness that everything you have built, everything you are, floats above an abyss that will swallow you the moment you stop paying attention to it. I find it difficult to describe precisely why that image affects me the way it does. I've kept coming back to it. The trees that couldn't grow upward, growing downward instead. And there's something there that I can't fully articulate, and I've decided to stop trying and just leave it where it sits. That feeling, the alertness that comes from knowing the ground you stand on is made, not given, that it will not hold you unless you hold it. That feeling runs through every great Venetian institution. The constitutional design of the Doge's office, the industrial organization of the arsenal, the theology, and I mean that word seriously, of stealing a saint's body from Alexandria and hiding it under a pile of pork so that Muslim customs officials would not inspect the cargo too closely. That last one I am going to linger on later because it delights me in a way that I recognize is probably disproportionate, but I don't care. It is the most Venetian thing that ever happened, and I need you to understand it properly when we get there. But first, breathe into it. Let the weight of what's covering you be the weight of that stone, above that timber, above that clay. What kept it from sinking was never luck. Tonight we are going in, La Serenissima. We're going to sit in the dark of the 5th century and watch a people, the Veneti, Roman citizens, merchants and farmers and minor officials who had spent their whole lives assuming the empire would function, that the roads would stay safe, that the legions would come. We are going to watch them flee the burning cities of the Roman world ahead of something that moved too fast for any defense to form against it. We are going to watch them find, in the least hospitable place imaginable, the one advantage their enemies could never take away. And we are going to follow what they built from that beginning, through 1,000 years of shipbuilding and constitutional invention and sacred theft and commercial cunning and naval war and artistic brilliance and deliberate, slow, magnificent decline. And we are going to arrive at the end of all of it in a room in the Doge's palace on the evening of the 12th of May, 1797, and we are going to watch the last Doge of Venice remove his golden horn-shaped cap of office and hand it to his servant. And we are going to hear what he said in that moment. And when we hear it, we will understand. I think we will understand everything there is to understand about what this city had been why it still matters, 4 centuries after it ended. To anyone alive today who has ever looked at the mud and the salt water from which all human things ultimately rise and wondered if something worthy could be built from it. The world that produced Venice was a world coming apart. The Western Roman Empire, roads, laws, legions, provinces, the vast administrative machinery that had imposed a particular order on the known world for centuries, had been cracking along its fault lines for a long time before the Veneti ran. The most terrifying force doing the cracking in the 5th century was the settled, road-building, city-dwelling world of the late Roman provinces, had almost no framework for understanding, let alone stopping. The Huns did not fight the way Romans fought, and they did not advance in ordered formations or besiege cities with methodical patience or maintain supply lines or observe the diplomatic conventions that even the most hostile of Rome's earlier adversaries had generally respected. They swept, they destroyed, they moved across open landscape with a speed that left defenders with nothing. No time, no framework, no precedent to reach for. Their leader had been given, even in his own lifetime, a title that tells you everything about what his contemporaries felt when they watched him approach. They called him the Scourge of God, as though heaven had finally run out of patience with the sinful earth and sent something that did not negotiate, something implacable. And when this force swept down into the prosperous, fertile, and comfortable region of northern Italy called the Veneto, into Aquileia and Padua and Altinum, into the cities where people had spent their whole lives inside the assumption that the machinery would hold. Those people faced the choice that history has forced on human beings in every age, and that never becomes easier no matter how many times it has been made. Stay in the place you know. Hope for mercy from something that does not understand the concept, or leave everything and run. Many of them ran. The direction they ran was toward the sea, not because the sea promised anything. There was no plan, no vision waiting, no destination with its arms open. The sea was in front of them and the burning was behind them, and the only geography that offered any possibility at all was the one where a horse-mounted army could not easily follow. And that's it. That's the founding of Venice, a direction that was mostly just away. The lagoon was not welcoming. I need you to hold that. Don't let what Venice became, the gold, the light on the water, the particular amber of an evening over the piazza, don't let any of that drift back into this moment, because the beauty came later. The beauty was the product of centuries of labor applied to a situation that was at its origin simply awful. A vast, shallow maze, mudflats and saltwater channels, and small, low islands that barely cleared the surface at high tide. Winter, brutal. Summer, loud with insects. The smell of salt decay hanging over everything, permanently. The way certain smells occupy a place so completely, you stop noticing them and they just become the air. No fresh water, nothing farmable, no trees, no stone, no natural resource of any kind, except one: safety. The one virtue that outweighed every disadvantage, present in this desolate water world in absolute abundance. A horse-mounted army cannot fight in a shallow lagoon. The same water that made the environment so hostile to human habitation was an impenetrable barrier to the cavalry that had been burning their cities. The channel shifted. The mudflats swallowed you if you didn't know where to step. You could not navigate it without a guide who had spent years learning its specific and moving secrets by daily use, by the body, by mistake. And the people burning the mainland had no such guide. You could not ride through it. You could not march through it in formation. You could barely cross it at all. For people with nowhere left to go, being difficult to reach was not merely an advantage. It was everything. It was the whole foundation. So they stayed, and the staying was not triumphant. It was grinding and cold and uncertain, and for a long time, years, then decades, they fully intended to go back. They watched the mainland across the water with anxious eyes, told themselves the storm would pass, that the invaders would be driven off, the cities repaired, the old life resumed, that this was temporary, that this was not their life. The storm did not pass. The Western Empire continued its long collapse. The Ostrogoths came, then the Lombards. Each new catastrophe on the mainland sent fresh waves of refugees into the lagoon. And decade by decade, the settlement grew. And what had been temporary became permanent. And what had been a refuge became a home. And what had been a desperate huddle of survivors became something that needed a name and a government and an identity, and more urgently than any of those things, a floor. How do you build a city of stone on waterlogged mud? This is the first real problem. In many ways, it is the most defining problem the future Venetians ever had to solve, because the way a people solve their first impossible problem tells you almost everything about who they are going to become. The solution was not elegant, not in any aesthetic sense, not inspired, not beautiful, not the kind of thing you draw on a wall and admire. It was the solution that emerges when you look at an impossible situation with absolute clarity and ask a very specific question. Not what would be ideal, but what would work. What worked was this. You drive wooden stakes into the mud, thousands of them. Slender, pointed timber piles cut from mainland forests, sharpened and driven down by hand, one after another, day after day, year after year, driven down through the soft mud until they hit the dense, hard-packed clay and compressed sand several meters below the surface. Then you pack them so closely together that they form below the water and the mud, something like an artificial floor, a dense underwater forest sealed from the air by cold anaerobic darkness. The darkness preserves them, keeps the rot from finding them. Then you lay platforms of heavy timber across the tops of the piles, then stone across the timber, and then you build. And the city that rises above is, in the most literal sense, a city built on an upside-down forest. The trees that couldn't grow in the lagoon, driven beneath it, holding everything up. Some of those original piles are still there, beneath the stones of the city, as solid as they were 15 centuries ago. I keep returning to this fact, and I'm not entirely sure why it hits me the way it does. Maybe it's just the scale of the commitment it represents, the sheer accumulated human labor of it. Or maybe it's something harder to name, the idea that beneath every palazzo and every church and every bridge in Venice, there is a piece of wood that a human being cut and sharpened and drove into the mud by hand in the early medieval period. And that piece of wood is still doing its job, still holding up the stone above it, still fulfilling the function it was made for, by people who have been dead for 1,000 years. The dead are still holding up the city. I don't know if that's a definition of durable genius or something else entirely. Both, maybe. I think both. The city that grew from those foundations was unlike any other city in the world, not just visually, psychologically. The daily fact of living on water, of conducting every ordinary thing through a medium that required constant skill and constant attention and constant respect, shaped the people who lived there in ways that were deep and specific and, in the end, irreplaceable. Children in Venice learned to row before they walked confidently on level ground. Men navigated by the feel of the tide, the smell of the wind, the particular quality of light on the water at different hours of different seasons. Not by roads, not by landmarks in the ordinary sense. The women conducted daily business from the prows of small boats in channels so narrow 2 vessels could barely pass without scraping. The sea was not a backdrop to life in Venice. It was the medium, the material the city was suspended in. And that daily intimacy shaped a particular kind of mind. The lagoon rewarded those who understood it and punished those who didn't. And it did not punish gently. You had to learn its rhythms and its hazards and its peculiarities, not as abstractions, but as knowledge felt in the arms and the gut and the deep body memory that only comes from years of repetition in conditions that don't allow for error. The people who survived and thrived in this environment were, almost inevitably, people of intense practical intelligence, great adaptability, a clear-eyed realism about the world as it actually was. You can feel this quality running through everything Venice ever built. Every institution it designed, every decision it made across 5 centuries of commercial and political and military life. The same ruthless clarity about what is real and what is useful that drove the first settlers to drive those piles into the mud. That quality, more than any specific genius or any particular lucky accident of history, is what explains how a city with no natural resources, no military tradition, no agricultural hinterland, no stone, no fresh water, became for 1,000 years one of the most powerful and consequential states in the world. No natural resources. I want to linger on that for a moment because I don't think it lands properly on first pass. Nothing. They had water, which was also their enemy. They had fish, they had salt, which they harvested from the shallows, and which turned out to matter more than you'd expect. That's approximately the full inventory of what the lagoon offered. Everything else, the marble, the timber, the grain, the silk, the gold, had to be acquired. And acquiring things you don't have from people who do have them is, at its core, what commerce is. And the Venetians became the finest practitioners of commerce in the medieval world, in part because they had no other option. Commerce or die. The choice clarifies the mind. Anyway, the city, however cleverly built, however deeply its people have absorbed the lessons of living on water, requires more than physical ingenuity to last 1,000 years. It requires a political architecture as carefully designed as the physical one. The question of who would lead Venice and on what terms and with what constraints. This was never an abstract philosophical question for the people who had to answer it. It was rooted in the most direct and painful possible experience. These were people whose families had fled the mainland precisely because they had seen what unchecked individual power looked like in practice. They had watched cities burned and fields destroyed and neighbors killed by men serving the ambitions of warlords and tribal chieftains and petty kings who had taken power by force and saw no reason to moderate it. They had no illusions. They had, in the most literal sense, run from those illusions across open water and into a saltwater maze. So when the question of leadership arose, as it had to, as the lagoon settlements grew in complexity and population through the 6th and 7th centuries, the answer they gave was one of the most sophisticated pieces of constitutional design in the history of the pre-modern world, the Doge. The word comes from the Latin dux, meaning simply leader. And that choice of title, I think the choice was deliberate. I think someone understood exactly what they were doing, announces immediately what this figure was and was not: a leader, a symbol of the state, a figurehead of immense dignity and elaborate ceremony whose actual power was constrained by a web of institutions and oversight mechanisms so carefully designed and so continuously refined and tightened across the centuries that it would make even the most cautious modern constitutional theorist sit back and nod slowly in something close to admiration. Not a monarch, never a monarch. The Doge wore robes of extraordinary richness and was processed through the piazza on feast days with a ceremony so layered and so precise it took hours. He lived in a palace that was also a seat of government, that was also a prison, that was also a church, all of it continuous, all of it deliberate, the architecture of power made literal in stone. He was the face of Venice to the world. Ambassadors kissed his ring. Foreign dignitaries reported home about his magnificence, and he could do almost nothing without permission. This is the part that I find myself most drawn to, maybe disproportionately, but I've made my peace with that. The Venetians were so afraid of what a powerful Doge could become that they built constraints into the office with an almost obsessive precision. A Doge could not receive foreign ambassadors alone, could not open letters addressed to the state without witnesses present, could not leave Venice without permission. His family members were excluded from positions of power specifically to prevent the accumulation of dynastic influence. When a Doge died, a commission was immediately formed to examine whether he had violated any of his constitutional obligations during his time in office. And if they found violations, his estate could be fined. He was accountable after death. After death. The Venetians were building accountability into the grave, and I don't think that's rhetorical excess. I think that is an accurate description of what they actually did, and the reason they did it was that they understood something with the clarity that only comes from having once lost everything, that the most dangerous moment in any system of governance is the moment when one person starts to believe that their judgment is more important than the rules that constrain it. They had seen where that led. They had run from where that led, across cold water, into the mud. They were not going to let it happen again. The Doge was elected for life, not born to it, not capable of passing it to his children. And the election itself, I need to try to describe this properly because the bare facts of it are almost too strange to believe if you encounter them without preparation. The process involved multiple rounds of voting and sortition, committee formation and elimination, ballots and lotteries interlocked in sequence, the whole mechanism designed so that no single faction could control the outcome. You would vote to select a committee, and then lottery to thin it, and then vote again within the result, and then lottery again, and then vote. 10 stages in total, 10 alternate rounds of election and chance, the human will and blind luck braided together so tightly that manipulation became nearly impossible. The design was not meant to produce the best man, exactly. It was meant to produce a man nobody could call their own. A consensus, a figure who belonged to the whole of the nobility, because no part of it had been able to install him. Once elected, the Doge swore an oath. Not a simple oath, now a document of extraordinary length and specificity called the Promissione Ducale, read aloud publicly at his inauguration, which laid out with meticulous precision every single thing he could and could not do. And this document grew longer with every election. Every time a new Doge took office, the lawyers and the councils reviewed the behavior of his predecessors and added new restrictions wherever experience had revealed new possibilities for abuse. New Doge, new loopholes found, new loopholes closed. The document was a living record of 1,000 years of hard lessons about the specific ways power tends to corrupt, each clause a scar from something that had actually happened, or nearly happened, or been attempted and caught. By the end of the Republic, the Promissione Ducale took hours to read in full. The restrictions, when you look at them in detail, move between the brilliantly systematic and the almost comic in their thoroughness. Any letter the Doge received from a foreign power had to be opened and read by state censors before it was placed in his hands. He could not conduct personal correspondence with foreign rulers without official oversight. He could not appoint his relatives to significant offices. His sons were specifically banned from positions of power. He could not leave the city without explicit permission. He could not accept private gifts from foreign powers. He could not conduct private business of the kind that might create personal financial interests at odds with the interests of the state. He was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a man elevated to the highest symbolic dignity imaginable, while simultaneously being deprived of almost every instrument by which that dignity might be converted into actual power. A figure who embodied everything and controlled nothing. This is the central invention of the Venetian constitutional mind, and I think it deserves a moment of real attention, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a genuine idea about how power works. The Venetians understood in the body from experience, that the office and the man inside it had to be separated. The office could be magnificent. The man had to be constrained. The robes could be gold. The hands inside them had to be watched. Most political systems struggle to hold this distinction for a generation. Venice held it for centuries. The real power resided in the councils, above all in the Great Council, the Maggior Concilio, the supreme legislative assembly of the Republic, composed of all the male members of all the noble families, inscribed in the Golden Book. The Golden Book had been closed in 1297, in the process known as the Serrata, after which membership became hereditary and entrance from outside was essentially finished. The Great Council was the source from which all other authority ultimately flowed. It elected the members of every other council and committee and magistracy that ran the daily business of the state. It elected the Doge through that elaborate process. It debated and voted on all matters of major policy. Nothing of consequence could happen in Venice without its involvement. And yet, even the Great Council was not sovereign in any unlimited sense. And this is the part that takes a moment to absorb. Venice's genius lay precisely in the multiplication of checks, the proliferation of overlapping authorities, each of which served as a constraint on all the others. The Senate was a smaller, more active, deliberative body that handled the detail work of policy. The procurators of St. Mark were officers of great prestige and near permanent tenure who administered the state's financial and legal affairs with an independence that let them resist even pressure from the Doge himself. The avogadori were state attorneys with the power to veto legislation they deemed unconstitutional, each institution watching the others, each one limited by the existence of the rest. Let me collect the thread here, because we are about to go somewhere darker. All of this, the councils, the checks, and the promission ducale read aloud for hours, the ballots and the lotteries and the overlapping jurisdictions. All of it was the product of a single clear-eyed fear, the fear of the one, the fear of the man who accumulates enough authority to stop being answerable to anyone. Venice had been founded by people who had seen that man up close, who had watched what he did and had run. The entire constitutional architecture of the Republic was, at its heart, a system built by refugees who never forgot what they were fleeing. That fear produced genuine brilliance. It produced institutions of extraordinary sophistication that the rest of Europe was still centuries away from approaching. It also produced something else, and there was an institution in Venice that perhaps best captures the particular flavor of Venetian political culture in all its brilliance and its darkness simultaneously. The product of the same constitutional mind that designed the Doge's constraints, the same clear-eyed pragmatism that built the underwater forest, the same people who understood that the world would not respect your feelings but would respect your ability to read it clearly. We are going there next. The Council of Ten, created in 1310, born from the aftermath of a failed coup by a Venetian nobleman named Bajamonte Tiepolo, established as a temporary emergency security committee. And then, as emergency measures almost always do, it stayed. The temporary became permanent. The exception became the rule. If you have ever watched a government grant itself extraordinary powers in a moment of crisis and then quietly neglect to return them, you already understand the basic mechanics of how the Ten came to be, what it became. What it became was this: a small, secretive, extraordinarily powerful committee whose remit was the security of the state. They investigated conspiracies and treasonous plots. They operated a network of informers throughout the city and throughout the empire. They could arrest and try and sentence and execute in complete secrecy, with none of the protections of ordinary law applying to those they pursued. Their proceedings were conducted behind closed doors. Their deliberations were sealed. Their sentences could not be appealed. Those are the facts. I'm going to state them plainly and move on, because I think they land harder without decoration. The Venetians understood perfectly that such an institution was both necessary and dangerous. This is one of those moments where their clarity of vision is genuinely uncomfortable to admire, because they looked at the thing they had built, this machinery of secret arrest and unappealable sentence. And they did not flinch from what it was, and they did not dismantle it, and they also did not leave it unwatched. The 10 were elected annually by the Great Council, rotated regularly to prevent any individual from accumulating permanent personal power through the institution. Their membership overlapped with other bodies in ways that created mutual surveillance. The watchers were watched. The institution that watched the city was itself embedded in the same culture of institutionalized suspicion that governed everything else. And then there were the Bocche di Leone, the lions' mouths, carved stone slots in the shape of open mouths set into the walls of public buildings throughout Venice, into which any citizen could deposit an anonymous written denunciation of a neighbor, a colleague, an official suspected of corruption or conspiracy or crime against the state. The denunciations received, investigated, treated with the seriousness appropriate to matters of state security. No signature required, no confrontation necessary. You wrote your suspicion on a piece of paper and you fed it to the stone mouth in the wall, and you walked away and the machinery took it from there. And I've been trying to think of a way to describe what it must have felt like to live inside that system, and I keep coming up short. Something like knowing that the walls were always potentially listening, but that the walls were also, in some sense, on your side, that the same mouth that could swallow a denunciation of you could swallow a denunciation of your landlord, your magistrate, the official who had taken a bribe at your expense. The system was available to everyone. That was part of its genius and part of its horror simultaneously. And I genuinely cannot tell you which quality outweighs the other. I'm not sure the Venetians would have found the question interesting, or what the Bocche di Leone created, what the entire architecture of surveillance and secrecy and institutionalized suspicion created was an atmosphere of constant pervasive accountability, the knowledge that any person at any time might be observed, might be denounced by anyone with a grudge or a conscience or a cold calculation to make. And this atmosphere was, paradoxically, the foundation of Venice's extraordinary political stability. The republic built on institutionalized mistrust was a republic in which no one could trust themselves to act without consequence. And in a world where the usual human tendency toward the accumulation of unchecked power was blocked at every possible point of entry, the system held. It held for 1,000 years. I keep writing that, and it keeps not feeling entirely real. While the kingdoms and principalities of mainland Europe were convulsed by dynastic struggles and baronial rebellions and the devastating personal ambitions of powerful men, while thrones changed hands through blood, and sons killed fathers and brothers, killed brothers, and whole lines were extinguished for the crime of being in someone else's way, Venice remained calm. The same families, the same councils, the same institutions, the same constitutional logic, generation after generation after generation. Not because the Venetians were less ambitious than other people, because the system absorbed and channeled ambition so effectively that it could never build to the kind of pressure that topples states. Anyway, out of this stability came wealth, and because a stable political environment is the first prerequisite for long-term commercial investment. This is not a complicated idea, but it is one that history has had to teach over and over to people who would prefer to believe otherwise. Merchants need to know that contracts signed today will be honored tomorrow, that laws will not change at the whim of a favorite, that debts will be collected by impartial institutions and not by whoever has the largest private army this particular season. Venice provided this, with a consistency essentially unparalleled in the medieval world. The city built on mud had built around itself a political architecture as solid and as cunningly designed as those wooden piles in the lagoon floor. A structure designed to hold, and it held. But the story is never just about the holding. And there is always also the reaching. And the direction Venice reached was east, always east, toward the greatest concentration of trade and wealth and commercial sophistication in the known world, Byzantium. For the first few centuries of its existence, Venice was not fully independent. Technically, officially, it existed in the shadow of the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of Rome in its eastern half, centered on Constantinople, which was for most of the early medieval period simply the greatest city in the world. Its population dwarfed any Western European city. Its markets handled trade from 3 continents. Its imperial court maintained the lineage of Rome's emperors in living, unbroken continuity. A ceremony of succession that had been running so long, it had become a kind of theology. Venice, as a community of former Roman citizens on technically Byzantine territory, was officially a duchy of the empire, nominally acknowledging the emperor in Constantinople, nominally. In practical terms, as the generations passed, the empire's ability to exercise real control over this distant lagoon community became increasingly theoretical. The distance was too great. The lagoon was too difficult to project power into. And the Venetians were, this is the only honest way to put it, too determined to allow anyone to govern them who was not themselves. So the relationship shifted, less subject and sovereign, more two parties who had found each other useful. Byzantium needed Venice's navy to help hold off Norman invaders from the south and Arab raiders from the east. The Venice needed Byzantium's markets to access the silk and spice and grain and luxury goods that merchants throughout Western Europe would pay extraordinary prices to possess. Mutual utility, held in careful equilibrium for centuries until 1082. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was facing a serious military threat from the Norman Robert Guiscard in the south, and he needed help, and he was desperate enough to pay whatever Venice asked. What Venice asked was staggering, and Alexios, with his back against the wall, paid it. In a document sealed with his golden seal, he granted Venetian merchants the right to trade throughout the entire Byzantine Empire, completely free of customs duties. Every port, every route, every commodity, exempt from the taxes that all other merchants, including the emperor's own Greek subjects, were required to pay. Their own quarter in Constantinople, their own docks, their own warehouses, their own church, placed in commercial terms above the law of the empire itself. The Venetians flooded in. They became wealthy, very wealthy, and then wealthier still. Wealth attracts resentment, the way standing water attracts insects. I know that simile doesn't quite close properly, but I'm leaving it because it's close enough, and the alternatives I tried were worse. The Byzantine Greek merchants who paid taxes that the privileged Venetians were exempt from watched this foreign community grow fat on privileges wrested from imperial desperation. The resentment was real, and it accumulated, and it expressed itself periodically in violence, riots, massacres of Venetian merchants during moments of political tension, the kind of mob reckoning that happens when economic grievance has been building long enough, and the moment suddenly feels right. In 1171, the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos attempted to break the Venetian stranglehold on his commerce. He ordered the mass arrest of all Venetian merchants throughout his territories, the confiscation of their goods, thousands imprisoned or expelled in a single coordinated action. The shock to Venice enormous, economically, yes, but also in the particular way that wounds to pride are always more lasting than the wounds to the body. The relationship never fully recovered. Over the following decades, as the Byzantine Empire weakened under the pressure of external threats and internal decay, Venice's attitude toward its old patron shifted from useful service to something colder, a mixture of commercial rivalry and diplomatic resentment, and underneath it all, this is the part I want to be precise about: the cold arithmetic of opportunity. Constantinople was an extraordinarily wealthy city. The Venetians knew its markets intimately. They knew its weaknesses. They knew the fault lines. They knew the corruption that had set into its ancient institutions, the way old wood sets with rot from the inside, solid looking until the moment it isn't. This knowledge would become, in the fullness of time, something that was used. I want to pause on that sentence because I think it does something that I should be more explicit about. What I'm describing, the accumulation of knowledge about a former ally's weaknesses, the long, patient storage of resentment, the cold arithmetic that eventually tips from grievance into calculation. This is not incidental to the Venetian story. This is the Venetian story, or at least it is one of its central rhythms. Venice did not act on impulse. Venice did not burn with the hot anger of the betrayed. Venice filed things away. Venice waited. Venice looked at the available geometry of the situation and asked what was possible now, what would be possible later, and what price it was willing to pay. The answer to that last question, when Constantinople eventually came back into the frame, would shock the Christian world. But that comes later. For now, just hold the shape of this relationship. The former subject that outgrew its patron, the city that knew the great empire better than the empire knew itself. The merchant who had been robbed and had not forgotten and had not quite forgiven, and was watching the debtor's situation with the particular attention of someone who understands that the right moment to collect is not always the obvious one. Venice was watching. Venice was always watching. and Constantinople was getting weaker. Before we get to what that knowledge made possible, we have to make a detour into a harbor in Alexandria, into a basket of pork, into the question of what a great city needs in order to believe in itself. There is a moment in the development of every serious civilization when it decides what its soul is and where that soul lives. For Venice, that moment arrived in the 9th century through an act of thievery, so brazen and so theologically creative that it has been admired and argued about ever since. The Venetians understood something their contemporaries also understood, but rarely acted on with such decisive efficiency. In a world where sacred relics were political assets of the highest order, possessing the right relic was not just a matter of faith, it was a matter of power. Venice's existing patron saint was the Byzantine martyr Theodore, and Theodore was precisely the wrong saint, a symbol that connected the city to its past as a dependent province of the Eastern Empire rather than announcing its independence as a power in its own right. What Venice needed, what it went and got, was the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist, author of the Second Gospel, whose remains were housed in a shrine in Alexandria under the control of the Abbasid Caliphate. In 828, two Venetian merchants named Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello sailed to Alexandria. Through a combination of bribery and a particularly creative application of the theological concept of rescue, the idea that removing sacred remains from an environment that did not properly honor them was not theft but salvation, they persuaded the custodians of the shrine to let them take the saint's body. Then they had to get it out of the city past customs officials. Here, the two merchants demonstrated the precise quality of problem solving their city had always rewarded. They placed the saint's body at the bottom of a large basket and covered it with quantities of pork and cabbage leaves. The Muslim officials, required by their faith not to handle pork, recoiled from the basket and waved it through without close examination. The sacred body of Saint Mark the Evangelist arrived in Venice hidden under a pile of pork. This is, and I have thought about whether I'm overreaching here, and I don't think I am, perhaps the most quintessentially Venetian sentence in the entire history of the city. The faith was real. The pork was also real. The two were not contradictory, but complementary. Tools deployed in service of a goal that mattered. Genuine devotion and absolute unsentimental cunning operating in the same gesture, indistinguishable from each other, neither one diminished by the presence of the other. The magnificent Basilica of San Marco rose over the saint's burial site. The winged lion that was Mark's traditional symbol became the official emblem of the Republic, appearing on coins carved into the stone of conquered cities, flying on the banners of war galleys, each lion a declaration that this place had come within the sovereign reach of Venice. The theft of the saint severed the city's spiritual dependency on Constantinople and proclaimed its new identity in a single act: sacred larceny, a theft that was also a birth announcement. I love this story more than I can justify professionally. I've noted that, and I'm moving on. They needed ships. Good ships, many ships, built quickly and armed effectively and maintained at a level of operational readiness no rival could match. The answer Venice gave to this need was the most consequential institution it ever built, the one that more than any other explains how a city with no natural military tradition was able to project force across the entire Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. It sat behind high walls of red brick in the eastern corner of the city. It was called the Arsenal, a word derived from the Arabic. To call it a shipyard is to miss entirely what it was. The Arsenal was the largest and most sophisticated industrial complex in Europe, at its height employing tens of thousands of workers, occupying an area comparable to a small town, and operating according to principles of production so far ahead of their time that they anticipate by several centuries what we now call industrial manufacturing. In the rest of the medieval world, ships were built one at a time. A skilled master shipwright overseeing the construction of a single vessel from keel to masthead, slow and customized, no standardization, no interchangeable parts, no economies of scale. Each ship a bespoke object, each ship its own problem. What the Venetians did in the Arsenal was something else entirely. Dedicated workshops producing standardized, interchangeable components in bulk. One workshop making oars, hundreds, then thousands of identical oars stored in vast warehouses. Another making rudders. Another making masts of specific standardized heights and diameters. Another producing rope measured and coiled and labeled. Foundries casting cannon in standard calibers, producing iron fittings of standard dimensions. Sailmakers cutting canvas to standard patterns. Every component of a warship designed to be identical to every other component of the same type, so that any part could be fitted to any ship without individual modification. And then the assembly. A hull pre-built to a standard design, towed into the Arsenal's internal canal at one end, moved slowly from station to station, each staffed by a guild of specialized workers, the Arsenalotti, each station performing its specific task. Rowing benches installed, rigging fitted, mast stepped, sails attached, armament added at the end. The productivity of this system was so extraordinary that contemporaries could barely believe the accounts of it. The most famous story describes a foreign dignitary entertained to dinner at the Arsenal who finished his meal to find a fully equipped war galley ready to launch, complete, armed, crewed, seaworthy, in the time it had taken him to eat. Whether every detail of that story is precisely accurate matters less than the underlying reality it describes, which is well documented from multiple independent sources. At the peak of its operation, the Venetian Arsenal could produce, equip, and launch a warship in a single day. In times of acute crisis, multiple ships per day, a single day. I find it genuinely difficult to convey how extraordinary this was in context. The gap between what the Arsenal could do and what any other shipbuilding operation in Europe could do was not a marginal competitive advantage. It was a different category of capability. It was the difference between an army that reloads and an army that doesn't need to. This was not magic, and it was not accident. It was the consequence of sustained institutional investment in standardized industrial production maintained over many generations. The same patient, methodical genius that had produced the Constitution, expressed now in steel and timber and rope. A machine for making the tools of power available at the speed that power requires them. The same mind that built the underwater forest. The same mind that watched the Doge with 100 overlapping eyes, the same mind that hid a saint under a pile of pork and walked calmly through customs. Always the same mind, always the same question. What does the problem actually require? And what is the most efficient possible way to provide it? Venice had the answer ready before most of its rivals had finished formulating the question. Power requires ritual to be fully real. This is something the Venetians understood in their bones, that a people need to enact their relationship to the force that sustains them, need to feel it in the body, in ceremony, in the repeated annual gesture that says, this is what we are, this is what made us, this is what we owe. The ceremony they created was called the sposalizio del mare, in the marriage of the sea, performed every year on the Feast of the Ascension. The entire city went out onto the water. The Doge, dressed in his most elaborate ceremonial robes, aboard the great gilded barge of state called the Bucintoro, a vessel so covered in carved and gilded figures that observers consistently described it as a golden mountain floating, was rowed out to the point where the lagoon meets the open Adriatic. And there he rose. He held up a ring of consecrated gold. He spoke the words of the ceremony. Desponsamus mer insignum veri perpetuique domini. We marry you, O sea, as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. The golden ring fell into the water. The sea received it. The marriage was renewed for another year. Close your eyes for a moment if you want. Let the image form. The golden ship on grey-green water, the ring falling, the silence after the words, and then the small sound of the water closing over it. That sound. And I realize I can't actually know what that sound was. I wasn't there. Nobody alive was there, but something in the imagining of it feels necessary. That sound is as close as it is possible to get, across all the centuries and all the distance, to understanding what Venice felt about itself. The ceremony continued every year until the very end of the Republic, one of the long threads of continuity running through the entire 1,000-year history. A reminder repeated annually in all its golden splendor of what the city was and where it came from. The dawn of the 13th century found Venice at a point of absolute readiness. Government stable, arsenal humming, commercial networks growing, and colonies establishing the skeleton of a maritime empire. Everything in place, everything operational, the whole machine running at the pitch it had been designed to run at. And then the Fourth Crusade arrived, called by Pope Innocent III in 1198, with the stated intention of reconquering Jerusalem. The actual structure of it was a problem, and problems for Venice had a way of becoming opportunities if you looked at them with sufficient clarity and sufficient patience, which Venice always did. To reach Egypt, where the military power controlling Jerusalem was based, a crusading army needed a fleet. The only fleet in the world capable of transporting an army of the required size was the fleet of Venice. The man who negotiated the terms of that fleet's hire was somewhere between 85 and 98 years old, depending on which source you trust. He was blind. He had lost his sight decades earlier in circumstances disputed, even in his own lifetime. Some accounts pointing to Byzantine treachery during a diplomatic mission, and whether that was true or not, it had clearly given him a personal grievance toward the Eastern Empire that the intervening years had not softened. His name was Enrico Dandolo, and he was Doge of Venice, and nobody disputed the acuity of his mind, which was still, at whatever extraordinary age he had reached, operating with the kind of clear, comprehensive, strategic intelligence that most people never achieve and almost nobody maintains. Dandolo listened to the Crusaders' request. Then he drove a bargain of exemplary hardness. Venice would suspend all normal commercial operations for a year. The entire industrial capacity of the arsenal would be dedicated to building a fleet large enough to transport 33,500 men, 4,500 horses, and 9 months of supplies for the entire force. In return, 85,000 silver marks and half of all territory conquered in the campaign. The Crusaders agreed. Then the army that actually arrived was far smaller than the one promised, far less able to pay the agreed sum. Venice had already spent the money. The fleet was built. The arsenal had been working for a year on this single contract. To dissolve the agreement would be economically catastrophic. Here, this is the moment I've been moving toward for several paragraphs. And I want to be honest that I've been impatient to get here. Here, Dandolo revealed the full quality of his genius. He made the Crusaders a proposal that was, in its structure, the purest possible expression of the Venetian approach to impossible situations. Identify the specific concrete mechanism by which the problem can be made to serve a purpose. They could not pay their debt in silver. They could pay it in service. Their first service would be to help Venice recover the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city, formerly a Venetian possession, that Venice wanted back. The Pope sent explicit instructions forbidding the attack, threatened excommunication. Dandolo was unmoved. He understood that the majority of the Crusaders, trapped in debt and unable to fulfill their holy vow without Venetian ships, had nowhere else to go. Excommunication is a powerful threat against a man with options, and against a man standing on a dock next to the only fleet that can carry him to his God-sworn purpose. It is considerably less powerful. The Crusaders took Zara, and then Dandolo did something else, something that belongs in a different category entirely. Not negotiation, not strategy, but theatre. Political theatre of the most extraordinary kind, and we are going to follow it exactly where it goes, because it goes somewhere that shocked the Christian world and whose consequences are still, in ways that are not entirely metaphorical, visible today. The old blind Doge stood before the assembled Crusaders. He was ancient. He could not see them. He spoke anyway, and what he proposed would redirect the most powerful military force in Christendom away from Jerusalem and toward a city that every person in that room had been taught to regard as the beating heart of Christian civilization. Constantinople, the city Venice knew better than any other. The city whose weaknesses Venice had been cataloguing for decades. The city whose wealth was extraordinary and whose defenses Venice had quietly determined were no longer what they once had been. The debt would be settled. The crusade would continue, eventually. But first, Venice had a use for this army, and Dandolo had the clarity of vision to see it and the nerve to say it aloud, and the particular kind of very old man's courage that comes from having genuinely nothing left to lose. During a great mass in the Basilica of Saint Mark, or in front of the assembled crusaders and the entire Venetian nobility, the old blind Doge publicly took the cross. He declared that he himself would personally lead the crusade, despite his age, despite his blindness. And the church erupted. Astonishment, emotion, the particular overwhelm that occurs when a gesture is so perfectly calibrated to its moment that the audience cannot locate the seam between the sincere and the strategic. A frail old man who could not see, pledging his life to a holy war. Whether the emotion was genuine or performed, or some complex mixture of both that only Dandolo himself fully understood, it achieved its intended effect with precision. It made refusal politically impossible. You cannot decline to follow a blind non-Argenarian into the service of God. The mathematics of the moment simply don't allow it. So the fleet sailed. Zara fell. The crusade wintered in the conquered city in a moral compromise that none of them could entirely resolve. Excommunicated by the Pope, camped in the ruins of a Christian city they had just sacked, the holy purpose of the whole enterprise receding into a complicated distance. It was there that a young Byzantine prince, named Alexios Angelos, arrived with an offer of staggering scope. Help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, restore the legitimate emperor, and he would pay the entire crusading debt, provide military support for the onward journey to the Holy Land, and submit the Orthodox Church to Rome. For the Crusader lords, this required justification, theological architecture, the elaborate rationalization of men who needed to believe they were still doing what they had sworn to do. But Dandolo, no justifications were necessary. Constantinople was the wealthiest city in the world and also Venice's greatest commercial rival and the source of decades of accumulated humiliation. The opportunity to install a friendly, indebted emperor on its throne was not something a man of his quality was going to pass up. The logic was clean. The arithmetic was clear. The fleet would go. In the summer of 1203, the fleet appeared before the legendary walls of Constantinople. The city's citizens watched from the walls in stunned disbelief. The young Alexios was installed. The triumph lasted months. Then the treasury turned out to be empty, and popular resentment of the Latin presence grew explosive. And in January 1204, the young emperor was murdered, and the Crusaders and Venetians camped outside. The walls were owed enormous sums by a dead man. The decision made in the spring of 1204 was to take what they were owed by force. On April the 12th of that year, the combined force launched its assault. The Venetian fleet acting as floating siege towers, carrying soldiers to the tops of the sea walls at heights the defenders had never anticipated, had never needed to defend against, because the sea walls of Constantinople had always faced an ordinary navy. And the Venetian fleet was no longer that. The walls were breached. The army poured through. What followed for 3 days was a catastrophe of almost biblical proportions. The sack of Constantinople, one of the defining events of the medieval period, the greatest center of Christian civilization, subjected to 3 days of looting and murder and wanton destruction that shocked even contemporaries who were not particularly squeamish about violence. The great library burned, mosaics smashed, sacred relics stolen, the bronze horses of the hippodrome torn from their plinth and loaded onto Venetian ships. I need to pause here, not to moralize. The moral weight of what happened is self-evident, and I don't think it requires my assistance, but because I think there's a risk of letting this moment blur into the general medieval background noise of violence and conquest. And it shouldn't. This was different. This was a Christian army, all called to defend Christian civilization, destroying the greatest Christian city in the world. The wound it opened between the Latin West and the Orthodox East did not close. In certain ways, it has never fully closed. What happened in those 3 days in April 1204 is still, across 8 centuries, a presence in the room when certain conversations happen between certain people. Venice played a sophisticated and calculating role in the division of the spoils. The Crusader lords wanted land, territories they could rule, estates they could farm. The traditional rewards of conquest understood in the traditional way. The Venetians took what served their commercial interests most directly. 3/8 of Constantinople itself. The 4 great bronze horses from the Hippodrome, which would become iconic symbols mounted above the portal of St. Mark's Basilica, grinning and green above the piazza for centuries, the most visible possible trophy. And most importantly, a string of strategic ports and islands that were to form the skeleton of the Stato da Mar, the state of the sea, the great island of Crete, Corfu, guarding the entrance to the Adriatic, Modon and Coron at the southern tip of Greece, known to Venetian sailors as the 2 eyes of the Republic. Through them, the Republic could see what was happening in the waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Each link in the chain chosen not for size or agricultural richness, but for strategic and commercial utility. Position relative to the major trade routes, quality of harbor, defensibility, value as a forward base for Venetian naval power, empire as infrastructure, empire as supply chain, empire not for the glory of conquest, but for the efficient movement of goods and ships across a vast maritime space. This is the thing I find most remarkable about the Venetian imperial mind, the complete absence of vanity in it. Other empires accumulated territory because territory was glory, because the map painted in your color was proof of your greatness, because conquest was its own justification. Venice accumulated what it needed and left the rest. The Venetians were offered enormous land grants in the aftermath of 1204 and declined significant portions of them because the lands in question were agriculturally rich but strategically useless. They could not be profitably integrated into the network. They were declined. Each possession was administered by a Venetian governor sent out from Venice for a fixed term, typically 2 years, short terms, mandatory rotation, classic Venetian constitutional design, preventing any individual governor from building a personal power base in his territory, watched and audited and held accountable on return in ways that would have been extraordinary by the standards of any other medieval colonial power. The same mechanisms, always the same mechanisms, the same fear of the one man who accumulates too much, applied now not just to the city, but to the empire. The constitutional logic that had governed the lagoon extended outward across the length of the Mediterranean, all the way to Cyprus, all the way to the Black Sea. The upside-down forest growing wider, the cold anaerobic dark preserving everything. Into this structure, this network of maritime power built on calculated violence and commercial intelligence, there arrived, in the second half of the 13th century, a story that extended the Venetian gaze to the edge of the known world and beyond it. Marco Polo was 17 years old in 1271 when he set out with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo on a journey overland to the court of Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in human history. They crossed Anatolia and Persia and the high mountain passes of the Pamirs and the vast Central Asian deserts, and arrived after 3.5 years at the court of an emperor of genuine intellectual curiosity who took a particular interest in the young Venetian. Kublai Khan found in Marco a sharp observer, a fluent learner of languages, a man capable of understanding unfamiliar societies without the usual European reflex of dismissing everything unfamiliar as inferior. The Khan put him to work. For 17 years, Marco Polo served as an official of the Mongol court. He traveled on the Khan's business to regions of China and Southeast Asia that no European had ever visited. He saw cities of a size and magnificence that dwarfed anything in Europe. Hangzhou, with a population that may have approached 2 million at a time, when the largest cities of Europe had perhaps 100,000. He saw the extraordinary administrative infrastructure of the Mongol Empire, the postal relay system, the use of paper money, the sophisticated canal systems. He heard tales of Japan, described as an island empire of fabulous wealth in the Eastern Sea. He witnessed the burning of black stones for heat, everything retained with the meticulous attention of the trained Venetian merchant that he fundamentally was, regardless of the extraordinary circumstances of his life. I keep getting stuck on that detail. The black stones burned for heat. Coal. He's describing coal, and he describes it with the same patient precision he applies to everything else. Just another observed fact filed carefully away. And there's something in that quality of attention, that refusal to hierarchy his observations, that feels deeply Venetian to me. Everything's noted, everything potentially useful, nothing dismissed. After 17 years, the Polos received permission to leave. They made their return by sea nearly 3 more years, arriving back in Venice in 1295 after an absence of 24 years. They're returning in rags, unrecognized by their own family, according to the famous story. To prove their identity, they cut open the linings of their tattered garments and poured out a river of gems onto the table. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds, sewn into the seams before they left, and surviving the entire 24-year journey, hidden in plain sight. The gems in the lining. Of course, that's how they did it. A few years after his return, Marco commanded a galley at the Battle of Cazzola, was captured by the Genoese, and in prison dictated the story of his travels to a fellow prisoner named Rustichello da Pisa, who transcribed it in the style of the chivalric romances he habitually wrote. The result was Il Milione, called a collection of lies by contemporaries who could not believe what it described. but which modern archaeology and historical research have confirmed in a remarkable number of its details. Christopher Columbus owned a copy. His copy, heavily annotated, the margins still filled with Columbus's handwriting. The dream of reaching the riches of the East by sailing west, planted directly by Marco Polo's descriptions of what lay there, waiting, and the European discovery of the Americas, which would ultimately destroy Venice's commercial dominance, rendering the whole Eastern Mediterranean network obsolete almost overnight, was in part the consequence of a book written by a Venetian merchant in a Genoese prison. There is a quality of justice in that, or irony. I find I cannot fully decide which, and I've been sitting with the question longer than is probably useful, so I'm going to leave it open and move on. Anyway, before the bypassing, before the long, slow decline that would end in Napoleon's ultimatum and the last Doge's quiet act of surrender, there was a moment of absolute danger that proved more definitively than anything else in the Republic's history what Venice was made of at its core. The War of Chioggia, the final and decisive conflict with Genoa, Venice's great competitor, an uncomfortable mirror image. That Italian city built on commerce and naval power, whose rivalry with Venice had been defining Mediterranean commerce for a century and a half, whose capacity to wound Venice went beyond the merely economic into something that felt, on both sides, almost personal, as though two people who understood each other too well had decided that one of them had to go. In the conflict that began in 1378, produced something that no enemy of Venice had ever accomplished, something that must have seemed to many literally impossible. The Genoese fleet, guided by the expertise of a Venetian traitor, forced its way through the outer defenses of the Venetian lagoon itself, captured the town of Chioggia at the lagoon's southern end, less than 15 miles from Venice. For the first time in its history, Venice was directly, physically threatened on its own doorstep. The Genoese were not beyond the horizon, fighting for distant trade routes. They were in the lagoon, on the threshold, close enough to see the towers and domes across the shallow water that had always been Venice's protection and now felt, suddenly, like a cage. The Genoese admiral, Pietro Doria, sent a message to the Doge. He would not make peace, he declared, until he had tamed the horses of St. Mark, the 4 great bronze horses above the portal of the basilica, the ones taken from Constantinople, the most recognizable symbols of Venetian power and pride. The city began to starve. The blockade cut it off from mainland sources of food and fresh water. Panic spread through the councils. The mood approached something that in that Venice, was almost without precedent: despair. And then Venice showed what it was made of. The Great Council voted emergency powers, new taxes raised, every available resource mobilized. The patricians set aside their rivalries and worked together with a unity their opponents had not anticipated and could not match. And the Doge went from house to house personally pleading with wealthy citizens to donate their fortunes to the Republic's defense. The man put in charge of the naval response was Vetta Pisani, one of Venice's most capable admirals, who had the particular disadvantage at this critical moment of being in a Venetian prison, imprisoned as the result of an earlier embarrassing naval defeat. I want to sit with that for a moment. The Republic's finest admiral, needed desperately for the city's survival, had to be released from the Republic's own prison first. A prison he was in because the Republic had held him accountable for a failure in the field. They locked up their own best commander. And then, when the walls were almost literally on fire, they let him out and handed him the fleet. And this is either admirable or absurd or both, and I genuinely cannot decide. It feels like both. It feels very Venetian. Pisani's plan was bold to the point of audacity. Not a direct confrontation with the Genoese fleet in the lagoon, where they held the advantage of position. Something entirely different. He would seal the channels in the outer barrier islands through which the Genoese had entered, blocking their exit by towing old hulks filled to the waterline with stone ballast to the channel entrances and sinking them in place under cover of darkness. The effect was instantaneous. The besiegers became the besieged. The blockade reversed. What followed was 6 months of grinding attrition through the winter of 1379 to 1380. The trapped Genoese fleet, unable to receive supplies or reinforcements, slowly starving and disease spreading through the overcrowded ships, repeated attempts to break the blockade, repulsed, a relief fleet beaten back. In June of 1380, the Genoese commander capitulated on terms that were complete and unconditional. Genoa never again challenged Venice for maritime supremacy. The great rivalry that had defined Mediterranean commerce for a century and a half resolved definitively, permanently. The city that had been all but destroyed by its oldest rival found, in the moment of its greatest danger, the reserves of courage and ingenuity and civic unity that had always been its deepest characteristic. The same quality that drove the piles into the mud, the same quality that hid the saint under the pork, the same quality that built the assembly line in the arsenal before the concept had a name. When the walls close in, Venice does not collapse. Venice thinks. With the Genoese threat permanently neutralized, the Republic entered its golden age, the age of the spice trade, the age in which the wealth of the East flowed through Venice in quantities that built the palaces lining the Grand Canal, paid for the paintings of Titian and Veronese, funded the war fleets that defended the empire. And to understand what that wealth actually meant, you have to entirely abandon the modern perspective on spice. Because in the medieval and early Renaissance world, spice was not merely a culinary addition. It was a substance of a completely different order. Pepper was medicine, preservative, one of the most effective means available for making salted meats palatable in an age without refrigeration. Nutmeg was ingredient in dyes, in medicines, in the elaborate pharmacopoeia of a world that had very few other reliable tools for treating illness. And above all, spice was a marker of social standing of the most explicit and unmistakable kind. To offer guests a dish generously seasoned with imported Eastern spices was to communicate something precise about your wealth and your sophistication. To be unable to do so was to advertise your poverty and your irrelevance as clearly as if you had posted a notice on your door. The demand for spice among the wealthy classes of Europe was essentially inelastic. They would pay almost any price. a pound of pepper worth more than a skilled craftsman would earn in several weeks. Nutmeg at times valued ounce for ounce more highly than gold. The numbers sound like exaggeration, and they are not. Venice had established a position in this trade that was for most practical purposes a monopoly. The power of their fleet, the network of colonial ports, diplomatic relationships with the sultans of Egypt and the Mamluk rulers of the Levant, the commercial infrastructure of the Rialto, all of it interlocking, all of it mutually reinforcing, all of it pointing toward the same result. No other European power could effectively buy spices at source. Everyone else bought from Venice, at Venice's prices, on Venice's terms. The great merchant convoys, organized by the state rather than by individual merchants, which is itself a characteristically Venetian detail. The state as commercial actor, and the commercial infrastructure as a function of governance, sailed to Alexandria, carrying the products of Northern Europe, and returned with their holds full of the fragrant cargo of the East. The arrival of a spice convoy in Venice was always a moment of collective celebration. The air over the city filling with the sharp, complex alien scent of pepper and cinnamon and cloves, the smell of money and distance, an extraordinary human effort, something that had begun in a market in Calicut or a warehouse in Alexandria, passed through a dozen hands across half the known world, and arrived here, in this impossible city, in these narrow channels between these marble facades, above this upside-down forest. The city that built its physical foundations on timber driven into mud had built its economic foundations on a mountain of pepper. From that mountain of pepper rose everything beautiful about the city at its height. The gold on the basilica, the canvases in the churches, the palaces reflected in the Grand Canal at dusk, that particular quality of Venetian light that painters kept trying to capture and kept almost getting right, the light that falls differently here than anywhere else, because it comes off the water from every direction at once, filling the shadows, making everything glow from underneath. All of it paid for by pepper, by the willingness of European aristocrats to pay extraordinary sums to make their food taste of somewhere else, by the long patient commercial intelligence of a people who had found, in the least promising place imaginable, the one advantage that could not be taken from them, and had spent 1,000 years converting that advantage into everything you see when you look at a photograph of Venice and feel, without quite knowing why, that something about it is almost too beautiful to be real. It was real, every brick of it. The security and prosperity of the Golden Age created a new problem, as security and prosperity have a tendency to do. The patchwork of competing states on the Italian mainland was consolidating rapidly and violently, above all under the Visconti dynasty of Milan, which was conducting what looked increasingly like a systematic campaign to bring the entire north of Italy under Milanese control. For Venice, the implications were existential, not in the naval sense it knew how to handle, but in a terrestrial sense it had always managed to avoid. Venice could not feed itself. All its food came from the mainland. Its timber came from the mainland. The mountain passes through which northern European trade flowed were on the mainland. If Milan controlled the territories immediately behind the lagoon, it controlled Venice's food supply, its timber supply, its land routes. the water that had always been Venice's protection would become Venice's cage. So the Republic faced a constitutional debate that was, in the deepest sense, a debate about what kind of thing Venice was. The traditionalists argued with considerable logic that Venice's entire identity was maritime, and that to involve itself in mainland politics was to betray its fundamental nature, to take on obligations and enemies and expenses that the sea had always allowed it to avoid. And the expansionists argued equally logically that the old comfortable distinction between maritime and terrestrial affairs was becoming untenable, that a Milan controlling the territories on Venice's doorstep was a more immediate and more dangerous threat than any Ottoman fleet on the horizon. The expansionists prevailed. Under Doge Francesco Foscari, Venice launched a sustained military campaign. Padua fell, Vicenza, Verona, Bergamo, Brescia. The terra firma was born, a substantial territory of fertile land and prosperous cities that would remain part of the Venetian state until the very end of the Republic. But the acquisition of a land empire brought something Venice had managed to avoid for most of its history: land warfare. And land warfare brought the condottieri, mercenary military captains who recruited and maintained their own armies and offered their services to whoever would pay them most. The tension between Venice's constitutional culture of institutionalized suspicion and the fundamental unreliability of men whose loyalty was written in silver rather than blood was constant and occasionally lethal. Most famously in the case of Francesco Busoni, called Carmagnola. He had won major victories for the Republic, been showered with honors, granted estates, celebrated. His subsequent inconsistency in the field led Venice to suspect him of maintaining secret communications with his former employers in Milan. The evidence was ambiguous then, and remains ambiguous now. I've read the accounts and I genuinely cannot tell you with confidence whether he was guilty. But in the Venetian system, the mere existence of credible grounds for suspicion was sufficient to trigger action. The threshold was not proof. The threshold was credible grounds. In 1432, Carmagnola was summoned back to Venice. The pretext was warm and apparently friendly. He came without suspicion. He found the doors locked, arrested by order of the Council of Ten, tried in secret on charges of treason, executed in the Piazzetta of St. Mark between the two great columns facing out across the water. His head struck off in public. The message clear and deliberate and unmistakable. Venice would use the condottieri, would pay them well and deploy them effectively, but would never trust them. The moment it suspected betrayal, it would act with the cold, complete, merciless efficiency that had always been the final instrument of the Republic's will. I find myself rushing past Carmagnola, and I want to slow down slightly, because there's something in his story that I think gets lost in the broader sweep of Venetian institutional brilliance. He may have been innocent. The evidence genuinely does not resolve cleanly, and he was executed in secret by a committee on a charge he could not properly answer through a process that allowed no appeal. The same system that produced the most sophisticated constitutional checks in the medieval world also produced this: a man summoned home on false pretenses and beheaded. Both things are true, and both things came from the same source. I said at the beginning that Venice was a story about a system, and this is what I meant. Systems do not have consciences. They have logic, and sometimes the logic eats people. Anyway, while the wars of the terra firma were conducted at a distance on the dusty plains of the Italian mainland, the city of Venice was living through a period of extraordinary cultural flourishing. The wealth from the Eastern trade continued to pour in. The architecture, a unique synthesis of Byzantine influence and Romanesque solidity and Gothic tracery and early Renaissance innovation, belonged to nowhere else, expressed in every arch and column and mosaic something that could only have come from this particular city and this particular history. To walk through Venice in the 15th and 16th centuries was to walk through the most beautiful city in the world. I don't think that's a romantic overstatement. I think contemporary accounts support it as a simple descriptive claim. If the gondola was the vehicle through which this beauty was navigated, it is an object of considerable design genius that I want to linger on for a moment, partly because it deserves it, and partly because I find the engineering of it genuinely delightful. The gondola's elongated asymmetrical hull is subtly curved along its length. One side is slightly longer than the other. This asymmetry is precisely what allows a single gondolier using a single oar in a specific complex technique to propel it in a straight line rather than in circles. The curve corrects for the one-sided thrust. The apparent imbalance produces perfect equilibrium. It is, in miniature, an almost perfect metaphor for the whole city, the thing that looks wrong from the outside working exactly as intended. For centuries, the gondola was also a canvas for the display of private wealth. The great families commissioned their gondolas in the same spirit they commissioned their palaces. Gold and silk and carved figures and bright color, each boat announcing its owner's standing to everyone. It passed in the narrow canals. Then, in 1562, the Venetian government passed one of the more unusual sumptuary laws in the history of any republic. All gondolas were to be stripped of their decorations and painted black. No exceptions. No exemptions for particular wealth or distinction. The black gondola was the law of the republic, intended to prevent the competitive spending that threatened civic harmony. The arms race of private display that was consuming fortunes and breeding resentment. The effect was something nobody could have entirely predicted, and the black gondola became one of the most recognizable and resonant images in the world. Something about the dark hull against the green water, the solitary figure of the gondolier, the slow, silent, inevitable progress through the labyrinthine canals, suggesting mortality, the passage of time, the beautiful futility of trying to hold on to things, the city that was always slowly sinking, always being reclaimed by the sea that had given it life, expressing something essential about itself in a black boat moving silently through narrow water. The law meant to suppress display produced the most powerful image Venice ever made, which is, when you think about it, also very Venetian. The unintended consequence that turns out to be more durable than the intention. The constraint that produces the beauty. The limitation that becomes the symbol. At the upside-down forest, one more time, in a different form. And the Carnival, the extraordinary institution that had no precise parallel anywhere else in the world. The annual takeover of the city in the weeks before Lent, in its greatest period, lasting not weeks but months. And the central defining feature of it was the mask, the buta covering the upper face, the volto in pure white, the moretta of black velvet held in place by a button between the teeth, making the wearer entirely mute for as long as they chose to wear it. All of these masks sharing a single essential property. Behind them, identity dissolved. A nobleman indistinguishable from a merchant indistinguishable from a commoner, a woman able to move through public spaces with a freedom impossible to a known individual of her sex and station, able to speak, to negotiate, to be present in the city in ways that the unmasked world simply did not permit. The anonymity of the mask creating, for the duration of the carnival, a social space unlike anything available for the rest of the year. The rigid hierarchies of Venetian society temporarily suspended. Anything might be said to anyone. Any relationship might begin or end without consequence, attached to a face. The labyrinthine streets becoming at night, under the light of torches and lanterns, a maze of possibility and intrigue and reinvention. I find myself wanting to linger here, longer than the narrative strictly requires. There's something about the mask that I keep returning to. The idea that the same city which built the most elaborate machinery of surveillance in the medieval world also built an institution designed to make surveillance impossible. The Bosch de Leon in the walls, swallowing your neighbor's name. The bouter over your face, dissolving your own. Both products of the same culture, the same constitutional mind. I don't entirely know what to make of that. I'm not sure it resolves. This was also the city that opened the first publicly regulated gambling house in the Western world, the Ridotto, in 1638. Masked gamblers playing at hazard under the supervision of state-licensed patrician bankers. The state taking its percentage, the players risking their fortunes. The Venetian instinct to regulate and profit from human impulse rather than suppress it, applied now to vice with the same systematic intelligence it had applied to shipbuilding and constitutional design, and the first public opera house in the world. The Teatro San Cassiano, 1637. The Venetian commercial mind, seeing immediately that people would pay to watch opera if given the opportunity. Within a few decades, Venice had more than a dozen opera houses serving audiences that included visiting foreign aristocrats and ordinary citizens who had saved for weeks to afford a seat in the upper gallery. Opera as mass entertainment, opera as commerce. Only in Venice would this have been the obvious next step, but Antonio Vivaldi was born in this city and spent much of his professional life as music master at the Ospedale della Pietà, one of Venice's charitable institutions caring for orphaned girls who were given a musical education of astonishing quality. For them, he wrote the hundreds of concertos and sacred works that are now among the best-loved pieces in the classical repertoire. The Four Seasons, emerging from an orphanage in a sinking city above an underwater forest. I don't know why that feels significant, but it does. Canaletto fixed the visual memory of Venice in his view paintings, the Grand Canal, the Piazza San Marco, the lagoon, with a combination of topographical precision and golden atmospheric warmth that defined for 2 centuries the way the entire Western world imagined the city. Even people who had never been there knew what Venice looked like because Canaletto had told them. But while the city was becoming the capital of European pleasure, the great school of its art and music, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding westward throughout the 15th century with a methodical and terrifying consistency. In 1453, Constantinople fell to Mehmed II, the Queen of Cities, the 1,000-year capital of the Byzantine Empire, fallen. For Venice, the implications were immediate and existential. The Ottomans now controlled the Bosphorus and were positioned to challenge Venetian dominance throughout the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. The entire network of ports and islands and trade routes that the sack of 1204 had built key suddenly under threat from a power that was not going to stop and that was not going to negotiate from weakness. What followed was a century of almost continuous defensive warfare. Negroponte falling in 1470 after a siege in which the Venetian garrison fought with a courage its government was unable to adequately reinforce. This is the part I find hardest to read in the sources. The garrison holding, and the relief fleet arriving too late. The city already taken. Coron and Modon, the two eyes of the Republic, falling in 1500. Cyprus coming under direct Ottoman assault in 1570. The assault on Cyprus triggered the most dramatic moment of this entire period. The Holy League, assembled under papal sponsorship, including Venice and Spain and various Italian states, confronted the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras off the coast of western Greece. The Battle of Lepanto, October 1571. Two fleets together, comprising more than 400 galleys and smaller vessels. The largest naval engagement in the Mediterranean since antiquity. At the heart of the Christian fleet were 6 enormous vessels Venice had contributed, the galleasses. Massive hybrid ships combining the oar-driven maneuverability of the galley with the artillery capacity of the sailing warship. Floating gun platforms bristling with cannons on all sides towed forward before the main engagement to open fire on the advancing Ottoman vanguard, disrupting the Ottoman formation before the main battle had even begun. What followed was hours of brutal close combat. In the two fleets grappling together, boarding and counterboarding, fighting hand-to-hand on blood-slicked decks. At the center of the battle, the two flagships grappled. Venetian and Spanish soldiers stormed the Ottoman flagship, killing the Ottoman admiral Ali Pasha, tearing down his banner. The sight of the admiral's standard falling sent panic through the Ottoman fleet. The retreat became a rout. Approximately 170 Ottoman galleys captured or sunk. Tens of thousands killed or captured. 12,000 Christian galley slaves freed from the oars of the captured fleet. Venice erupted, the celebrations reflecting the depth of the anxiety that had preceded them. This was genuine release, genuine relief, the exhale of a city that had been holding its breath for a century. And then the aftermath delivered its own peculiarly Venetian lesson. The Holy League fell apart almost immediately after the victory. Victim of the competing interests of its members, Spain and Venice, and the papacy each pulling in different directions the moment the immediate threat had been resolved. Within 2 years of Lepanto, Venice had concluded a separate peace with the Ottomans, ceding Cyprus, keeping its trading rights in Ottoman ports. The merchants had spoken. in the only language that ultimately mattered to them and to the city they had built. The battle had been glorious. The galleasses had changed the shape of naval warfare. Lepanto would be remembered and celebrated for centuries. Cervantes fought there and considered it the finest day of his life, which tells you something about the scale of it. But commerce was eternal, and Cyprus was gone, and the trading routes had to be maintained, and a dead market is worth less than a living compromise. This is the moment, if you are looking for a moment, where you can first feel the shape of what is coming. Not collapse, not yet, nothing so dramatic, something slower. The Ottoman expansion had been checked at Lepanto, but not reversed. The colonial network was contracting, and somewhere in the Atlantic, on ships built in Lisbon and Seville, using knowledge that had in part flowed from a book written by a Venetian merchant in a Genoese prison, the world was being remapped in ways that would make the Eastern Mediterranean network obsolete. The pepper routes were about to be bypassed. The upside-down forest was still holding, but the water around it was changing, and the threat arrived not from a fleet or an army or a hostile empire, but from a map. Specifically, the map that Bartolomeu Dias produced when he rounded the southern point of Africa in 1488 and demonstrated that the Indian Ocean could be reached by sailing around the continent. Venice received this news with the kind of guarded attention that any shrewd commercial power gives to developments that might affect its competitive position, hoping perhaps that the distances would prove prohibitive, that the established routes through the Mediterranean would retain their advantages, that the world would not actually change in the way the map suggested it might. Then in 1499, a Portuguese fleet commanded by Vasco da Gama sailed into the harbour of Lisbon, having rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crossed the Indian Ocean and visited the ports of East Africa and India and traded for spice in the markets of Calicut and returned. A Venetian diarist named Girolamo Priuli wrote in the privacy of his diary that this was the worst news the Republic had ever received. Worse than any military defeat, worse than the loss of any colony, because it was structural. It could not be reversed by sending a fleet or hiring a condottiere or conducting a clever diplomatic negotiation. It was simply the new shape of the world, and the new shape of the world did not require Venice. The Portuguese could now purchase spice directly from the producers in India and Southeast Asia, eliminating every single middleman through whose hands the goods had previously passed, and with them every opportunity for Venice to impose itself as gatekeeper of the trade. The price of spice in Lisbon would undercut the price in Venice at every point on the scale. The entire commercial architecture on which 1,000 years of Venetian wealth had been built was obsolete, not damaged, not weakened, obsolete. Venice did not accept this verdict without a fight. It tried diplomacy. It tried engineering, considered the construction of a canal at Suez that would allow Venetian galleys access to the Red Sea, a project technically conceivable, but financially and logistically beyond the Republic's means. Neither worked. Other Atlantic powers entered the oceanic trade and competed to make it still more efficient. And Venice had not been defeated. It had been bypassed, which is in some ways a worse thing. A defeat can be avenged. A loss can be recovered. Being bypassed means the world has simply moved to a different road and left you standing on the old one, still functional, still beautiful, still conducting your ancient business with your ancient competence, but no longer at the center of anything. The center had moved west to Lisbon, and then Amsterdam, and then London, and it was not coming back. I find I want to rush past this part, and I'm making myself slow down because I think the bypass is the most important thing that happens to Venice, and it tends to get less attention than the drama of Lepanto or the sack of Constantinople. Those events feel like history. The bypass feels like economics, but the bypass is what actually ended Venice as a world power, quietly, without a single battle, simply by making its position irrelevant. Even as its commercial foundations were being undermined, Venice maintained its distinctive political culture with remarkable tenacity. The Inquisition, the Catholic Church's mechanism for identifying and punishing heresy, a powerful and feared institution across most of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Venice had its own version, composed of clerical figures, yes, but insisting on the presence of 3 lay observers at every proceeding. The Savi all'Eresia, secular magistrates appointed by the Senate, whose role was to ensure that the interests of the Republic were protected at every stage. When unable to determine theological questions, but able to suspend proceedings deemed politically motivated, to report back to the Senate on anything that threatened the stability or commercial interests of the Republic. The practical consequences were considerable. Venice was home to a large German merchant community, many of them followers of Luther, too commercially important to be persecuted in the manner the Counter-Reformation demanded. The Venetian Inquisition understood this. The city also had one of the largest and most economically active Jewish communities in Europe, concentrated in the ghetto, a word coined in Venice, the etymology coming from the Venetian term for the foundry district, where the community was first confined, and the Jews were important to the city's financial and commercial life in ways the Republic understood clearly and valued practically, tolerated and restricted and taxed and protected simultaneously in a manner that expressed perfectly the Venetian capacity to hold contradictory imperatives in a workable equilibrium. There's something in that formulation, tolerated and restricted and taxed and protected simultaneously, that I find myself unable to smooth into either condemnation or praise, which I suspect is exactly the right response. It was neither enlightened nor cruel by the standards of its time. It was Venetian, pragmatic. The community was useful, therefore the community was maintained. Therefore the community was controlled. Therefore the community was, within those controls, defended. The logic was consistent even when the humanity was complicated. A word coined in Venice, ghetto, still in use, still carrying its meaning across 5 centuries. The most dramatic confrontation of this period came in 1606 when Pope Paul V placed Venice under a full interdict, essentially excommunicating the entire Republic and suspending all religious services within its territory. The most severe weapon available to the papacy deployed in full. Venice's response was remarkable for its cool, measured defiance. The clergy were instructed to continue performing religious services in open and deliberate violation of the papal order. The theologian Paolo Sarpi was engaged to produce detailed legal and theological arguments for the Republic's position. The same instinct that had built the Promission Ducale applied now to theology, the careful, lawyerly accumulation of argument, the institutional response to institutional pressure. After a year, the papacy backed down. The interdict was lifted without Venice making any significant concessions. A city-state had faced down the full authority of the papacy and won. The principle that sovereign states had the right to govern their own ecclesiastical affairs, which would become fundamental to the political order of the modern world. The principle that underlies the separation of church and state in every democracy that came after was asserted and successfully defended by the most serene republic in the year 1606, on the far side of its commercial peak, its empire contracting, its pepper roots bypassed, its colonial network slowly losing links, still thinking clearly, still acting with precision, still reading the world as it actually was, rather than as sentiment might prefer it to be. The commercial genius was fading. The constitutional genius was not. And I want to be careful here, because I think it's actually important. This is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about Venice in its long decline, that the system outlasted the conditions that had produced it and went on working, went on functioning with its characteristic precision and its characteristic cold intelligence, even as the world it had been designed to navigate was dissolving around it. The councils still met. The Doge still swore his oath. The Promissione Ducale was still read aloud. The 10 still watched. The lions' mouths in the walls still waited for their paper offerings. The machine kept running, long after the fuel that had powered it was mostly gone. The end came from the land, from the north, from the most consequential military mind of the age, Napoleon Bonaparte, whose army of Italy swept through the peninsula in 1796 with a speed and violence that shattered the old political order almost overnight. The way a stone dropped into still water doesn't negotiate with what's already there. Venice clung to neutrality, its default posture, its ancient instrument, the diplomatic reflex of 1,000 years of successful navigation between larger powers. But neutrality is a tool that works only when the parties around you agree to recognize it. And revolutionary warfare does not observe the basic rules that all previous parties had understood. And Napoleon manufactured a pretext from a Venetian mob attack on French soldiers in Verona and delivered his ultimatum with the brutal clarity of a man who held every card in the deck. The Republic must dissolve its ancient government, establish a new democratic municipality aligned with France. If it refused, the army would advance. The lagoon that had protected Venice from every invader for 1,000 years provided no protection against modern artillery positioned on the shore. The water that had been the founding advantage, the gift that had made everything possible, the cold, shallow maze that no horse-mounted army could cross, meant nothing against cannon. The world had changed and the lagoon had not. The final debate took place in the Doge's palace on May the 12th, 1797. The Great Council assembled in the same room and under the same magnificent painted ceiling where it had assembled to make the decisions of the Republic for 500 years. The faces around the table pale with fear and with a grief deeper and more complicated than simple fear, because they knew what they were going to do. There was, in the final reckoning, no alternative. Their army was negligible compared to Napoleon's veterans. Their navy was a shadow of what it had been. The lagoon offered no protection against cannon positioned on the shore. The choice was between a dignified surrender that might preserve the city and a heroic but utterly futile last stand that would ensure its destruction. As the vote was being taken, a few musket shots from somewhere outside the palace sent a wave of panic through the chamber. The vote was completed in haste and disarray. The 1,000-year Republic of Venice voted itself out of existence by 512 votes to 20, with 5 abstentions. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, returned to his private apartments and removed the golden horn-shaped cap of office, the cap that no other ruler in the world had ever worn, the cap that was not a crown because Venice had never had a king, and handed it to his servant. "Take it, I shall not be needing it again." A few days later, French troops marched into the Piazza San Marco. For the first time in its history, a foreign army occupied Venice. The great bronze horses were removed from the basilica and shipped to Paris. The horses stolen from Constantinople, now stolen again, passing to the next empire in the sequence. The golden Bucintoro, in the great gilded barge on which the Doge had sailed out every year to marry the sea, was publicly dismantled, the gold stripped from its carved surfaces and melted down. The most serene republic was over. I've been writing toward that sentence for a long time tonight, and now that it's here, I find I don't entirely know what to do with it. There's a flatness to it. Take it. I shall not be needing it again. 5 words to end 1,000 years. I keep turning them over, and they keep being exactly the right words, and also somehow insufficient, the way the right words always are when the thing being named is large enough. But here is what was not over. Here is what has never been over. Here is the question that the darkness keeps open and that sleep does not entirely close. What does it mean? What does it actually, honestly mean? That a city built on water, founded by desperate refugees with nothing but mud beneath their feet and cold water around them and the burning world at their backs, managed to build not merely a civilization, but a civilization that lasted, that held, that endured through 10 centuries of war and plague and commercial revolution and papal confrontation and the slow erosion of everything that had made it possible. The system they designed, the councils, the constrained doges, the lions' mouths, the mandatory rotation, the short terms, the overlapping authorities, the institutionalized suspicion, the promission ducale read aloud for hours at each inauguration, held for longer than Rome in its imperial glory, longer than most nations that exist on the earth today. They understood it. In the 5th century, sitting on their mudflats with cold water around their ankles and their eyes on the burning mainland, they understood that the only durable power is the power that is afraid of itself, that the only system that holds over the long run is the system that builds into itself the mechanisms of its own restraint. And here, this is the thing I've been circling all night, the question underneath the question. Here is what nobody mentions when they talk about Venetian genius. What did they lose by building that way? What could not be built in a system designed against the accumulation of individual greatness? What kinds of beauty and courage and audacity require the unchecked individual will to produce them? The Venetian constitution was a machine for preventing the dangerous man. But the dangerous man and the visionary man are sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the same person. What did the machine prevent that should have been allowed? What was never built, never painted, never sailed, because the system caught it before it could become itself? I don't have a clean answer. I've been sitting with the question longer than is probably wise at this hour, and I don't think it resolves. But I wonder sometimes if the answer to that question is the reason that Venice, in its long, slow decline, turned toward art and music and pleasure and Carnival and the black gondola on dark water, turned toward the things that require not power, but feeling, not system, but individual soul. Vivaldi writing concertos for orphaned girls. Canaletto standing at the edge of the Grand Canal in the morning light, trying to get the color of it exactly right. The masked figures moving through the labyrinthine streets at night, anonymous, briefly free of everything the Republic required them to be. If Venice, in its long and magnificent decline, was discovering something about the limits of institutional genius, something about the parts of human experience that cannot be organized or standardized or constrained into reliable productive output, then what it discovered was not a failure. It was something more interesting, more honest, something that sits with you now at this late hour and asks whether the most durable things we build are always the things we build when we are most afraid, in whether the most beautiful things are always the ones we make when the fear has passed and there is nothing left but to feel the weight of everything we have built and everything we have lost. The golden ring falling into the water, the small sound of it closing over, the particular quality of light on water when the morning is still far away and the night is doing what the night has always done, quietly, without asking anything of you except that you let it. The upside-down forest still holding, still there. Let that lie where it lies. Let the questions stay open the way Venetian questions always stayed open. The way the lion's mouth stayed open, waiting, never demanding an answer, but never letting you forget that the question had been asked. The arsenal walls still stand in the eastern part of the city. In the great entrance gate still bears the winged lion. The basilica still glitters with its Byzantine mosaics acquired across centuries of commerce and conquest and occasional sacred theft. The Doge's palace still stands at the edge of the lagoon, its Gothic facade reflected in the water on the basin. The Lion of St. Mark carved above every door and window. You can walk across the Bridge of Sighs, and if you are quiet and attentive, you can almost feel the weight of the centuries in the stone beneath your feet. The centuries of decisions made in dark rooms, of men deciding other men's fates, of a city that understood that the price of stability was vigilance, and that the price of vigilance was a particular quality of cold-eyed watchfulness that never fully relaxes, never fully trusts, never fully sleeps, as the word bank comes from the Italian banco, the bench that a money changer sat behind in the Venetian marketplace. The system of double-entry bookkeeping was codified in Venice in 1494. The terms debit and credit that appear in every set of accounts in the world, in every language, derive from the Latin as as it was used in the counting houses of the Venetian Rialto. The word quarantine derives from the Venetian practice of requiring ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor for 40 giorni, 40 days, a public health measure of remarkable sophistication, first formally established in Venice in the 14th century. If you carry those words through your day, if you say bank or debit or credit or quarantine, you are carrying Venice with you. The city that should not have existed. The city built on an upside-down forest. The city that married the sea each year and was ultimately left by it when the world moved its trade to different waters. The city that voted itself out of existence in a panicked chamber in 1797, and then spent the next 2 centuries becoming the dream that the whole world, even now, cannot quite forget. I want to pause on that last part, the dream. Because Venice after Venice, Venice as it has existed since Napoleon stripped the gold from the Bucintoro, is a strange kind of survival. The city is still there. The stones are still there. The water is still there, rising a little higher each generation, the sea making its slow claim. Millions of people walk through it every year and feel something they struggle to name, and some combination of beauty and melancholy, and the vertiginous sensation of standing inside history that has not quite finished being history yet. The upside-down forest is still holding up the stones. The piles driven by hand into the mud in the early medieval period are still doing their job. The dead are still holding up the city. I said that near the beginning of tonight, and I find I mean it more now than I did then. A republic built on institutionalized mistrust. And that mistrust, this is the thing worth carrying into sleep, the thing worth holding gently as the edges of the room soften and the weight of the night does what it does. That mistrust was the foundation of its extraordinary stability. Not the mistrust itself, but what the mistrust was in service of, which was the protection of a community against the thing that actually destroys communities, which is not external threat, it is internal corruption. The moment when the person entrusted with the system begins to believe they are larger than the system, that their particular genius, their particular devotion, their particular moment justifies placing themselves above the constraints that apply to everyone else. Venice said no for 1,000 years, said no through constitutional design that was continuously revised and continuously refined. Each revision a scar from something that had happened or nearly happened. Each clause a lesson written in the specific and non-negotiable language of experience. He said no through the Council of Ten and the Promissione Ducale and the mandatory rotation of governors and the short terms and the lion's mouths in the walls. Said no in every specific concrete mechanism it could devise against the specific concrete ways that power tends to corrupt. And it worked. It held. And then Napoleon came, and the holding was over, and the last Doge handed his horn-shaped cap to his servant. Take it. I shall not be needing it again. That sentence, I keep returning to it. I've come back to it 3 times tonight, and I think I understand now why it won't leave me alone, why it keeps surfacing. It is because it is completely without sentimentality, completely without self-pity, completely clear-eyed about the reality of the situation. The system is over. The symbol is no longer needed. Take it. No grand speech, no lamentation, no final gesture toward the sea, just the clean acknowledgement of what is true and the release of what is no longer useful. The Venetian quality that had built everything, the quality of seeing the world as it actually is rather than as one might wish it to be, expressing itself one final time in a private room to a servant in 5 words. It is the most Venetian thing that ever happened. More Venetian than the Arsenal, more Venetian than the Council of 10, more Venetian even than the saint hidden under the pork, because it is not performed for anyone. There is no audience. There is no constitutional mechanism requiring it. There is no foreign dignitary to impress, or enemy to face down, or merchant to negotiate with. There is just a man who has understood the situation with perfect clarity, and acted on that understanding with perfect economy, and let the thing go. The cap passed to the servant's hands. The 1,000-year republic ended in that transfer, and the water outside went on being what it had always been, indifferent, cold, carrying the light differently at each hour, holding up the stones above the ancient timber above the clay, doing what it was always going to do, regardless of what the humans on the surface decided to call themselves, or how long they managed to hold the line against the particular darkness that destroys things from the inside. The water is still there. The forest is still holding. The light on the water in the early morning, before the city wakes, and before the tourists come and the boats disturb the surface. That light is still the same light that fell on it when the first refugees pushed their boats into the shallow channels and looked back at the burning mainland and decided, without knowing what they were deciding, to stay. Let that be where we rest tonight. Let the question stay open. Let the lion's mouth wait. You've carried enough for one evening. The dark will hold the rest of it. But the city is still there. The stones are still there, above the timber, above the clay. The upside-down forest is still holding everything up. Those ancient pointed piles driven by hand into the mud by people who have been dead for 1,000 years, still doing what they were made to do, still fulfilling the function assigned to them by someone who is now beyond all names and all records. Someone who sharpened a piece of wood and drove it into the dark and trusted it to hold, and it held, and it is holding now, tonight, under the stones, under the water, in the cold, anaerobic dark, where nothing rots and nothing changes, and the centuries pass above without touching it. The lion still watches from the portal of the basilica, over the water that the Republic married for 10 centuries, over the water that is still there, still cold, still green, still moving with the particular patient movement of water that has been moving since before anyone thought to name it or claim it or drop a consecrated ring into it and call that an empire, still carrying in its light the memory of everything that rose above it. The golden barge, the ring falling, the small sound of the water closing over, and the morning is coming, and the darkness does its work, and then it releases you. This is what it has always done, and what it will always do, not as comfort exactly, but as fact, the same kind of fact the Venetians preferred. Not the fact that makes you feel better, but the fact that is simply true regardless of whether it makes you feel anything. The darkness does its work, then it ends. The weight of the blanket is not a burden, it is a shelter. There is a difference, and the body has always known the difference, even when the mind has forgotten. The golden ship is somewhere in the memory of the water. The ring is still down there somewhere in the mud of the Adriatic, settled into silt across 2 centuries of tides, surrounded by everything else the water has kept. The timber of the galleys, the anchors of the merchant convoys, and the ballast stones of 100 arsenali ships, the whole submerged record of 1,000 years of going out and coming back. The water keeps everything. The water forgets nothing. The water is patient in the way that only genuinely indifferent things can be patient, without effort, without intention, simply by continuing to be what it is. And there is still a question open in the darkness. Sleep will not close it. Sleep will soften it, will carry it somewhere underneath where questions go when the mind releases them. And it will be there in the morning in a different form, lighter, more manageable. The sharp edges of it worn down by the night, the way water wears down stone, slowly, without drama, by the simple, sustained application of presence. The question of whether it is possible to build something worthy of the mud and the salt water and the desperate beginning. The question Venice answered for 1,000 years, with genius and cunning and pragmatism and occasional ruthlessness, and always, underneath all of it, beneath all the councils and the constitutions and the lions' mouths and the Promotion Ducale and the black gondolas and the masked figures in the torchlit streets, always that original quality, the one that was born in the lagoon and never left it. The quality of people who know that the ground they stand on must be continuously maintained, that it will hold only as long as they hold it, that the water is always there beneath the stone and the timber and the clay, patient, indifferent, neither hostile nor kind, simply there, simply waiting, is simply being what it is, while the humans above it do what humans do. What makes the difference is not the absence of the water. It never was. What makes the difference is the quality and the ingenuity and the sustained collective effort of everything built above it. The choice made again every day to maintain what the day before had built, to drive the next pile, to read the Promotion Ducale again, aloud, all of it, however long it takes, to fill the lion's mouth, to show up to the council, to do the work that the work requires without sentiment and without illusion and without the comfortable fiction that the ground will hold itself. The ground does not hold itself. It never did. It only holds because someone decided in a desperate moment above cold water with burning at their backs that it was worth the effort of holding La Serenissima, the most serene. Not serene because nothing threatened it, serene because it had looked at everything that threatened it with clear eyes and built accordingly, and kept building and held and held and held until the morning it finally let go. And even then, even at the very last, with 5 words spoken quietly in a private room to a servant, with a simplicity that cost everything and showed nothing. Take it. I shall not be needing it again. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the questions stay where questions stay when the night is late and the mind is ready and the body has already gone ahead to where the body goes. The water is there. The forest is holding. The morning is coming. Good night.